I need to tell someone about this. Not because I think it will help, and not because I think anyone can explain it. I just need to say it out loud, because keeping it inside my own head is starting to change the shape of it, and I'm afraid that if I wait much longer, I'll convince myself it didn't happen. Or worse, that it did happen, and I made the wrong choice when it mattered. Megan and I had been together for almost 4 years when we took that trip. 4 years is a strange number. It's long enough that you've stopped performing for each other, but not quite long enough to know whether the silence between you is comfortable or just empty. We'd been in one of those stretches where everything was fine on paper. No fights, no big problems, just a slow, quiet flattening of something that used to have texture. She worked at a veterinary clinic in Denver. I worked as a project manager for a civil engineering firm. We had a nice apartment. We had routines. And somewhere along the way, the routines started doing all the work that we used to do ourselves. It was Megan's idea to go to Utah. We used to camp together all the time during our first year. Long weekends in the San Juans, overnight trips to Great Sand Dunes, that kind of thing. At some point we just stopped. Not for any reason. Life filled in the gaps, the way it does. So when she brought it up over dinner one Tuesday, central Utah, a full week, just us in the desert, I said yes before she finished the sentence. I think we both understood what the trip was really about without needing to say it. We left Denver on a Friday morning in late September, took my truck south through Salida, over Monarch Pass, then cut west, and dropped into Utah by late afternoon. The plan was to camp on BLM land, east of the San Rafael Swell, public desert, no permits, no designated sites, just open country. We'd picked it specifically because there would be nobody else around. That was the whole point. We wanted the kind of quiet that doesn't exist within range of a cell tower. The last town we passed through had a gas station and a post office and not much else. We filled up, bought ice, and turned onto a dirt road that headed south into nothing. The pavement ended and the world opened. Red rock and pale sand and juniper trees twisted into shapes that looked like they'd been trying to escape the ground for centuries. We drove for about 40 minutes on that road, all then turned off onto something that barely qualified as a track, 2 faded tire ruts winding between low ridges of sandstone. We found our spot around 6 in the evening, a flat clearing on a slight rise, ringed on 3 sides by low juniper, and one side open to a view that stretched all the way to the horizon. You could see the Book Cliffs far to the north, faint and blue. The ground was packed sand with a thin crust, the kind that crunches under your boots. No footprints, no tire marks, no trash, no sign that anyone had been here in a very long time. We set up the tent, arranged our gear, and built a small fire ring from stones we gathered nearby. Megan made pasta on the camp stove while I split kindling. We ate sitting on the tailgate, watching the sun go down, and for the first time in months, the silence between us didn't feel like something that needed to be filled. It just felt like silence, the real kind, the kind the desert is made of. That night, the stars were absurd. No moon, no light pollution, just the whole spilled mess of the Milky Way draped across the sky like it had always been there, and we'd just been too distracted to notice. We lay on a blanket outside the tent for a while, not talking, just looking up. I remember thinking that this was working. Whatever we'd come out here to fix, the desert was already doing it. We crawled into the tent around 10 and fell asleep fast. The kind of sleep you only get when there's nothing for miles. No traffic, no neighbors, no hum of electricity. just the occasional brush of wind against the rainfly and the vast mineral silence of the desert floor. I woke up first. The light inside the tent was that pale gold you get in the early morning when the sun is just above the ridge but hasn't cleared the juniper yet. I unzipped the flap and stepped out barefoot onto the cool sand, and then I stopped. There were cairns around the tent, small ones, maybe a foot tall each, some slightly less. Neat stacks of flat stones, carefully balanced, evenly spaced in a rough circle. I counted 8. They were about 15 feet from the tent on all sides, forming a ring around us with almost geometric regularity. I stood there for a long time. I remember the feeling precisely. Not fear, not yet. Just a blank, buzzing confusion, like my brain had encountered something it didn't have a category for and was refusing to process it. Cairns are normal things. Hikers build them. Trail crews build them. Our people stack rocks in the desert for fun. I'd seen hundreds of them in my life, but I had never seen 8 of them arranged in a perfect circle around a place where 2 people were sleeping. I called Megan out. She stood next to me in her camp shorts and my flannel shirt, squinting in the early light, turning slowly to take in the full ring. Neither of us said anything for a while. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked. She shook her head. We walked the circle together, examining each cairn. They were well built, not sloppy stacks, but deliberate constructions, each stone chosen to sit flush against the one below it. The stones were local sandstone, red and flat, the same stuff that littered the ground everywhere around us. Whoever built them hadn't needed to go far for materials. "Someone came through here," Megan said. "We're 20 miles from the nearest marked trail. People go off trail. Maybe someone thought it was funny." I looked at the ground around the cairns. The sandy crust held impressions well. Our footprints from the evening before were still crisp and clear, leading from the truck to the tent to the fire ring and back. But around the cairns themselves, there was nothing. No boot prints. No knee impressions from someone crouching to stack stones. No drag marks. Just the undisturbed surface of the desert floor, and then the cairns sitting on top of it like they'd grown there. I pointed this out to Megan. She looked, frowned, and then shrugged. Maybe the wind smoothed the tracks overnight. There hadn't been any wind. We knocked the cairns down. It felt like the right thing to do. A way of reclaiming the space. A resetting whatever strange equation had been introduced while we slept. The stones scattered easily. They were just rocks. I told myself that several times throughout the morning. They were just rocks, and someone with too much time and a weird sense of humor had stacked them up. It was odd, but it wasn't threatening. We were in the middle of nowhere, and odd things happen in the middle of nowhere. We spent the day hiking a shallow canyon about 2 miles south of our camp. Slick rock and pour-offs and a dry wash with cottonwoods whose leaves were just beginning to turn. It was a good day. Megan took pictures. I carried the water. We held hands on the walk back, which we hadn't done in a while. I didn't mention the cairns, and neither did she. That evening we decided to move camp. Not because of the cairns. At least that's what I told myself. We'd planned to explore different areas each day anyway, and there was a spot I'd seen on the map, higher up, on a broad sandstone bench with a 360-degree view. It would be a better camp, more exposed, more open. You'd be able to see anything approaching from half a mile away. We drove up a rough track and found the bench right where the map said it would be. It was perfect. Flat stone with a thin layer of sand, scattered juniper at the edges, and a view in every direction that went on forever. We set up the tent in the center of the open area, as far from any cover as possible. I didn't explain why I wanted it that way. I don't think I needed to. Dinner was quiet. The sunset turned the distant cliffs the color of rust and then ash. We watched it from our camp chairs, drinking instant coffee because we'd forgotten to bring anything stronger. I stayed up later than Megan, sitting by the fire, watching the dark settle over the benchland. Listening. The desert at night isn't silent exactly. There are small sounds, the scuttle of a lizard, the distant yip of a coyote, the faint creak of juniper branches adjusting to the cold. But those sounds only make the silence bigger. They give it scale. Nothing happened. No footsteps, no voices, no shapes moving at the edge of the firelight. I went to bed around 11, feeling foolish for having been on edge. The cairns were behind us. A story for later. A weird thing that happened once. I woke at first light again. I lay in the sleeping bag for a long moment, staring at the tent ceiling before I unzipped the flap. They were there. 8 cairns, evenly spaced, roughly 15 feet from the tent. A perfect circle. The same configuration. The same careful construction. On a sandstone bench miles from where we'd been the night before. This time, the fear arrived immediately. Not the dramatic, gasping kind. The slow kind. The kind that starts in your stomach and spreads outward like cold water, settling into your joints and the back of your neck. I stood in the tent doorway and looked at the ring of small stone towers and felt the ground shift under something I'd always taken for granted. The idea that the world operates on rules I understand. I woke Megan. She came out and saw them and didn't say anything for a long time. She just stood there, arms crossed, turning in a slow circle the way she had the morning before. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat and careful. These aren't the same stones. She was right. Yesterday's cairns had been red sandstone, local material. These were different. The stones were darker, gray and dense, with a faintly crystalline texture. I picked one up. It was heavier than sandstone, smoother. It looked like basalt, or something close to it. I'm not a geologist, but I know enough to know that dark volcanic rock doesn't naturally occur on a sandstone bench in central Utah. Someone had carried these stones here from somewhere else, a significant somewhere else. I walked the full circumference of the circle, crouching at each cairn, studying the ground. The sandstone surface didn't take impressions the way the sandy soil had, but there was a fine layer of dust and grit on the bench that would have shown disturbance. It showed nothing. No scuff marks, no evidence of weight being set down or knees pressing into the surface. The cairn sat on the stone like they'd been placed there by something that didn't touch the ground. "We need to leave," I said. Megan was quiet for a moment. She was looking at the cairns with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not fear, not exactly. Something closer to concentration. "What if they're not a threat?" she said. "Someone is building these around us while we sleep. That's a threat." "You don't know it's a someone." I didn't have an answer for that. She was right. I didn't know. But the alternative to a someone was a something, and that was worse. "What if they're markers?" she said. "Like boundary markers. What if they're keeping something else away from us?" "Keeping what away?" She didn't answer. We argued, but it wasn't really an argument. It was two people looking at the same impossible thing and reaching for different explanations because the real explanation, that neither of us had one, was too frightening to sit with. Megan wanted to stay one more night. She wanted to understand. I wanted to leave. We compromised the way couples do when neither person wants to be the one who blinked. We'd stay one more night, but I would keep watch. I spent the day on edge. We hiked a short loop near camp, but I couldn't focus on the landscape. I kept looking at the ground, scanning for cairns, for stones that looked deliberately placed, for any sign of pattern in the natural scatter of rock. I didn't find any. The desert looked exactly the way a desert should look. Random, ancient, and indifferent. That evening I set up a camp chair facing the open benchland, wrapped myself in a sleeping bag, and settled in with a thermos of coffee and my headlamp. Megan zipped herself into the tent around 9. I told her I'd wake her if anything happened. She told me to be careful, which struck me as an odd thing to say. Be careful of what? The dark came fast. No moon again. The stars turned on like someone had flipped a switch. I sat in my chair and watched the perimeter, sweeping my headlamp beam across the benchland in slow arcs every few minutes. The light caught juniper bark, stone, sand, the reflective eyes of something small that darted away. Normal things. I listened to the silence and the small sounds that lived inside it. I drank my coffee. By midnight, I'd settled into a rhythm. Sweep the light. Listen. Wait. Sweep the light again. And the desert gave me nothing. No footsteps. No movement. No shadows that didn't belong to something I could identify. I started to feel foolish again, the way you do when you're guarding against a threat that won't perform for you. The fear was still there, underneath, but the boredom was starting to cover it like sand drifting over a track. Around 2 a.m, something changed. I can't describe it precisely, which is part of what makes it so hard to talk about. There was no sound, no movement, no visible shift in the environment, but the quality of the silence altered. It became dense, attentive, like the difference between an empty room and a room where someone is standing very still behind you. The desert was the same in every measurable way, but it felt like it had leaned in. I stood up, swept the light in a full 360. Nothing. The juniper stood where it always stood. The stone was where the stone had always been, but the hair on my arms was standing up, and my heartbeat had shifted into a higher gear without consulting my brain. I stood there for a long time, turning slowly, holding the headlamp beam steady, daring the dark to show me something. It didn't. The feeling persisted, that sense of focused attention from something I couldn't see and couldn't locate, but it didn't intensify, and it didn't produce a source. Eventually the adrenaline faded, the way it does when there's nothing to sustain it. The silence relaxed. The desert went back to being the desert. I sat back down. My hands were shaking, but there was nothing to be afraid of. Nothing had happened. Nothing I could point to or describe. Just a feeling, and feelings don't build cairns. I fought sleep for another hour and a half. I lost the fight around 3:30, chin dropping to my chest, headlamp beam pointing at my own knees. I don't know how long I was out. Maybe an hour, maybe less. When I opened my eyes, the sky was just beginning to lighten at the eastern edge, and I knew before I looked. 12 cairns, not 8, 12. And the circle was tighter, 10 feet from the tent instead of 15. The new ones were built from a mix of stone types, red sandstone, the dark basalt, and a third kind I hadn't seen before. Pale, almost white, with a chalky texture. 3 different rock types that don't belong together, arranged in alternating order around the ring. I walked the circle with my heart in my throat. At the far side, opposite the tent entrance, I found something else. a single stone, perfectly round, perfectly smooth, sitting on the hood of my truck, balanced in the exact center of the hood like someone had measured it. The truck was 40 feet from the tent. Whatever placed it there had walked past me while I slept in my chair, or it hadn't walked at all. I woke Megan immediately. She came out and saw the new configuration and was quiet for a long time. I watched her face. She wasn't panicking. She looked, and I know how this sounds, she looked thoughtful, like she was working something out. "There are more," she said. "I know. And they're closer. I know." She walked to the nearest cairn and crouched beside it. She reached out and touched the top stone, the pale white one, very gently, the way you'd touch something you weren't sure was real. "Megan, don't." She pulled her hand back. Then she stood and walked toward the center of the campsite, the space between the tent and the fire ring, where we'd been cooking and sitting and existing for the past 24 hours. She stopped and looked down at the ground. "Come here," she said. I walked over. She was pointing at a spot just a few feet from the fire ring, where the thin layer of sand had been disturbed by our activity. But underneath the sand, partially exposed, was a shape. I crouched down and brushed the grit away with my hand. It was a cairn, an old one. 5 stones, stacked, in the lowest one half buried in packed earth. The stones were dark with mineral deposits and rough with lichen. This cairn had been here for a very long time, decades at least, maybe much longer. We had set up camp directly next to it. Our fire ring was 3 feet away. We'd walked over this spot dozens of times without noticing it, because it was flush with the ground surface, almost completely buried, and we hadn't been looking for it. Or, and this is the thought that sank its teeth into me and has never fully let go, we had noticed it, not consciously. Something in us had registered this spot, this exact spot, and had chosen it without understanding why. We'd felt drawn here the way a compass needle feels drawn north, not by decision, but by force. The new cairns weren't being built around us at random. They were completing a circle around an ancient center point that already existed, and we had placed ourselves at that center as precisely as if we'd been following instructions. "We're leaving," I said. "Now." This time Megan didn't argue. We packed in 12 minutes. I've never broken camp that fast. We threw everything into the truck bed without organizing it, collapsed the tent with half the stakes still in the ground, and got in and started driving. The benchland fell away behind us as we descended the rough track toward the dirt road. I was driving too fast for the terrain, and I didn't care. The truck bounced and slid on the loose surface, and I kept my eyes on the road and my hands tight on the wheel. Megan sat in the passenger seat with her feet on the dashboard and her arms wrapped around her knees, staring out the windshield. We'd been driving for about 10 minutes when I saw the first one, a small cairn on the right side of the road, sitting on a flat rock about 20 feet from the track. 4 stones neatly stacked. I almost didn't register it. Cairns on roadsides in the desert aren't unusual. People build them as route markers. Then I saw the second one, 200 yards later. Left side, same size, same construction, and the third, and the fourth. They lined the road at irregular intervals, alternating sides, each one visible from the last. Some looked fresh, clean stone, sharp edges. Others looked old, weathered, leaning, half collapsed. They stretched ahead of us along the road like a corridor of small sentinels, marking a route that someone or something had been maintaining for a long time. I couldn't tell if they'd been there when we drove in 3 days ago. I hadn't been looking. You don't look for cairns when you're not afraid of them yet. Were those there before? I asked. Megan didn't answer. She was staring out the side window, her face pale. We drove. The cairns continued. Some were close to the road, some farther away. Some were single stacks. A few were clusters of 3 or 4, arranged in small formations that might have meant something if I'd had the language to read them. I counted for a while and then stopped counting. There were too many. When we reached the paved highway, the cairn stopped. The last one sat at the exact boundary where the dirt road met the asphalt, a single tall stack, maybe 2 feet high, standing on the shoulder like a post. I turned onto the pavement and pressed the accelerator, and the desert fell away behind us, and neither of us spoke until we'd crossed the state line into Colorado. That was 7 months ago. We haven't been back. We don't talk about it often, and when we do, the conversations are short and careful, like we're handling something that might break. Here's what I keep coming back to. The cairns didn't hurt us. Nothing chased us. Nothing spoke to us. Nothing blocked our path or tried to keep us from leaving. In 3 nights, whatever was building those circles around us had every opportunity to do something violent, and it didn't. It just built. Quietly, invisibly, with materials gathered from places we couldn't identify, using a method we couldn't detect. It arranged stones around us while we slept, and when we ran, it let us go. And I don't know what that means. I don't know if the circle was a cage we escaped or a shelter we abandoned. I don't know if the old cairn at the center was a grave marker or a foundation stone. I don't know if the cairns along the road were following us or if they'd been there all along, guiding something toward that clearing where 2 people with a quiet fracture between them would eventually decide to sleep. What I do know is this. 3 weeks after we got home, I was doing laundry, and I found a stone in the breast pocket of the jacket I'd worn every day of the trip. Small, flat, perfectly smooth. Our dark gray with a faint crystalline grain. Basalt. Not a stone from Colorado. Not a stone I picked up. Not a stone I put in my pocket. I'm certain of that the way I'm certain of very few things. I showed it to Megan. She held it in her palm for a long time, turning it over, running her thumb across the surface. Then she set it on the kitchen counter and looked at me with an expression I still can't fully decipher. "It's just a rock," she said. She's right. It is just a rock. It sits on our kitchen windowsill now, next to a small pot of herbs that Megan keeps alive with more dedication than it probably deserves. Sometimes I catch myself looking at it when I'm washing dishes or waiting for the coffee to brew. It doesn't do anything. It just sits there, smooth and dark and quietly impossible. And it waits with the same patience that built 12 cairns around 2 sleeping people without making a sound. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it. I don't know if it's a souvenir or a summons or a piece of a pattern that won't be complete until I carry it back. And I don't know which possibility frightens me more, that the stone is meaningless, and the desert has already forgotten we were there, or that it isn't and it hasn't, and somewhere in central Utah, on a sandstone bench that we couldn't find again if we tried, there's a circle with a gap in it, 1 stone short of finished, and it's sitting on my windowsill.